Hugh, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Appreciate it. Up next, that was a good segue. I'm going to bring up Oliver Gassner for our Europe breakout session. Oliver's the perfect balance between scientist and businessman, I think. He has his master's in biotechnology, currently doing his MBA at Hult, and he's really passionate about the startup environment, probably the most passionate I've ever seen. So I'll pass it over to Mr. Oliver Gassner, the slave driver himself.
Thanks so much for everybody for being here. First of all, I would welcome my European fellows, Stefan, Alain, if you all come to stage, Chris, Espen. First of all, who is from Europe here? I would like to see a hand. Okay, great. We have a good number of Europeans. So, first of all, I think it's very interesting from what we've seen before. We have on this panel 3 people with a solid hardware background, not a software background. So I would first of all like to everybody to introduce yourselves to our panel, to our audience. Maybe Alain, if you could start.
Good afternoon. Yeah, perfect. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to be with you on this panel, Oliver. Very quickly, my background is I grew up in France. I come out of the semiconductor industry, so I had a first career in the semiconductor industry, and then I switched over to the investment side. I work at Crosslink Capital, which is a venture firm in San Francisco. I am responsible for the semiconductor materials and energy practice at the firm.
Testing. All right, so my name is Espen. I'm Espen Sivertsen. I work with Type A Machines as the Chief Operating Officer. I'm the one of the founders as well, founding team. We've been running for a year now. We're a startup producing 3D printers here in San Francisco. And we've been growing at 10% week-over-week growth rate for the last year, so it's an exciting space. Before that, however, I stem from Europe, from Norway. And I also lived 6 years in Denmark, working on my own startup there. I'm sure you'll hear more about that later.
Yeah. Also for me, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Stefan. I am actually from Denmark, and I'm the founder and CEO of Itembase currently. And I think if you want to have an impact on the world, then it's really difficult to do that in Denmark because it's a very small country with 5 million people. So that's why it's important to go global, I think.
Hi everybody, I'm Chris. I'm representing IE Business School, but I was a transplant from UC Berkeley to finish my PhD in mechanical engineering in Madrid, Spain, of all places. And through that whole exploration process, I ended up sort of developing products in Spain to try to sort of provide jobs to people in that country, as you may know, that are suffering from an economic crisis. And then from that, we kind of developed a process to help kickstart innovation using a process very similar to the Lean Startup. And so that got a lot of traction at IE Business School, and now I'm back here in San Francisco where kind of my home and family is, and looking to start a community around 3D printing as well that connects everybody in this audience amongst everybody, anybody in your network to people who know how to design 3D and connecting to 3D printers local to your area to rapidly prototype new things and build products. That's me.
Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, everybody knows about the crisis the Eurozone is facing at the moment. We see a lot of trend towards entrepreneurship, I think, at the moment, especially in the Baltic countries, Nordic countries. Finland just setting up a program where they rely heavily on VC money to kick off their whole industry. We see the same in Spain. Where do you see entrepreneurship in Europe 5 years from now? Do you think it's going to be strong enough to carry the Eurozone through the problems they face at the moment?
I guess I'll quickly speak on behalf of my experience, 2.5 years of experience in Spain, and I think they've really identified that entrepreneurship is a great way to create jobs. Small businesses are typically the huge job creator in any country. And Robert Solow, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, says that Technical innovation represents 80% of a country's economic strength. So anyhow, you know, I think that Spain has pushed towards that, technology, innovation, and they've created hubs like Madrid Emprende, which basically incubates people like me who have small project ideas, courses that we taught, and they're really pushing that direction. The problem is, there's a saying in Spanish is mucho ruido pero pocos nueces, which means a lot of bark but no bite. And so they need to get a lot more of doing as opposed to just talking about it. So I do believe it's going that direction, but they do face some cultural challenges.
Okay. Stefan, you've been exposed to the German ecosystem, which is certainly among the hottest at the moment. If you would tell a US startup to go to Europe, why should they go there, and where would you advise them to go?
To Europe or to Germany?
To Europe.
To Europe.
No, in Europe.
I would definitely advise them to go to some of the bigger hubs right now, which I think is London, Berlin, or maybe Barcelona. And I think it's very important what we're seeing, to also to maybe come back to the other question a little bit, is these hubs are growing up and it's actually connecting the countries a lot more. Before, and because of the language barrier, there's a lot of difficulties jumping between the countries, but with these hubs coming up, you're seeing entrepreneurs going back and forth from different countries to the different hubs. So I think it's important to be in one of the big ones if you really want to go there.
Mm-hmm. And if you compare these hubs to, for example, Bay Area hub, how, like on a scale, if the Bay Area is 100%, where do you rate these other hubs in Europe? Where are they standing at the moment?
That's really difficult to say. I don't know, maybe 20% or something like this. There are different pros and cons for the different hubs. So if you look at Berlin, it's a very creative city. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's cheap to live there. It's cheap to get, employees are not that expensive. But there's no real money compared to here or compared to London. Whereas London, there's a lot more money, so you can actually get your stuff funded. Barcelona, I have to say, I don't really know actually. I think it's kind of in the middle. So it's really hard to say, but I would say maximum 20%.
Okay, so Anna, you're...
I want to add to this a little bit, because I have also a little bit of insight on this. So the major hub you mentioned, so London, Berlin, Paris, out of the three, London is probably the most active. And compared to the United States, what is missing is really continuity of funding availability. So a lot of money comes from the government, the cities. There's about 6 incubators in Paris, about 750 companies at the early stage, seed stage. Sometimes they can raise the A money, but there's nobody to follow up. So what is missing in all of these hubs is really kind of the classical venture capital that takes care of the Series B and further out. So this is, in terms of talking and barking, at least they're talking, but the money isn't there yet.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting, sorry.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that as well, because it depends on what industry you're in, right? I mean, I'd argue that the industry you're in is going to be a very, very big factor in terms of where you want to position yourself in the world. Software, obviously, here in the Bay Area is a good place. But, just looking at Scandinavia, where I am from as well, you've got the Norwegian offshore industry, really big funding possibilities there. You've got, if you want to do sort of high-tech stuff, Sweden in Stockholm is a good place for cities. Sweden's a very concentrated market, very high rate of early adopters. Copenhagen, Denmark, very good for social apps, that sort of stuff. We like to call you'll forgive me, we like to call the Danes like the Italians of the North. It's very outgoing and friendly, and they surrender whenever there's a war on. So, kind of like there's a thing there as well. But I think the core point for me is, really thinking about where in the world, because we have the capability to travel anywhere now. Where in the world, what one city is it going to be that is best for my industry and my application? And go there and start there.
That's a very interesting point you raised. I think we hear nowadays a lot about the best of both worlds approach. So, for example, take engineering talent in Eastern Europe or something, and then do the marketing and all the prototyping here in the US. What kind of startups do you see have a legitimate reason to jump to Europe? Is it the market or is it the talent?
SFB? I have no idea. I mean, I think based on what I see from in the open hardware industry, I think particularly in England, there's a lot of really great research going on right now at the university level for open hardware, 3D printing, that sort of stuff. I think, I mentioned the offshore industry in Norway, shipping, a good place to be in Europe right now. Particularly with the northern territories opening up with channels to China and so on. France, maybe you can say something about
France, there's almost no venture capital industry to speak of. There's a lot of early money, there's a lot of early capital, mostly government, but there's almost no venture capital industry. I mean, the venture capital firms are really related to banks, and that's not really venture capital.
So I would say one great reason to jump in, at least to, let's say, Spain, which needs help, is that, we heard from the Latin American group before us, and obviously language is a great opportunity. If you speak Spanish to some degree, you can go into Spain, and if you have this sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneurial feel, you can jump in and be a big fish in a small pond. I mean, I just used arbitrage, right? I came from Silicon Valley, went to Spain where they were struggling, and I became the biggest entrepreneurial voice in that region. And that got me office space for a year for free for several, tons of space. I had several employees. Cost of labor is depreciated compared to our American counterparts, and you can find a lot of great skilled workers. Those countries are unfortunately going broke, investing in their people, which is great, except these people all then leave their countries and go work in other places in the world. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about going to Europe, I think, at least from the Spanish perspective, and you can increase your market size. A small portion in Spain, for me, it was great because we can now expand to Latin America by speaking Spanish and now have contacts in several different countries. But that, to me, I would think would be a great opportunity for Europe.
I absolutely agree. Going into, if you have a company that is running, going to also outside of the hubs, going to Spain and Madrid or whatever would be very good. My former company, we opened up our headquarters in Spain, also to be closer connected to South America. So it's a very good thing if you have your company up and running. If you want to start something completely new, I think you have to go to one of the hubs, and I'm not sure it depends on where it is.
Interesting. Alain, I think you want to add?
I think the two of you illustrate a very important point here, is that as an entrepreneur, you have an idea, you have a vision, you have a passion. You will go wherever it takes to realize it. So in your case, you went the other way, you went to Spain. A lot of entrepreneurs, especially in the hardware space, come to the United States because the infrastructure is much more, I would say, well established in that.
So let's talk about a bit about the money that is flowing in Europe. I think for those who are not from Europe, it's important to understand that most seed funding in Europe is done not by angels, but by governmental funds. For example, in Germany, the High-Tech Founders Fund is, I think, founding 90% of the very early stage investments. And they have very benevolent conditions for these investments. So, Alain, if you think about the connections that angels have here in the Bay Area with later stage VCs, so you have a warm handoff, you have your preferred angels you work with as a VC, do you see this as a restriction or as a benefit when you think about Europe from the VC perspective?
Sure. So, if I contrast the two, so I mentioned the incubator system in Paris, for example, which is mostly government money. So it takes the companies only so far, and then at some point they just hit a wall. There's just nobody to fund beyond that stage. In the Valley, for example, or even in New York City or other places in the US, but predominantly between New York and Silicon Valley, there is this whole system where angel investors, seed funds, larger funds kind of hand off one company to the next as the companies grow and as the company's capital requirements increase. The challenge I don't think it's a negative or a positive. The seed money is the seed money, wherever it comes from. I think the biggest challenge these companies in Europe have, mostly in France, a little bit in Germany, less in England, is that there is nobody behind that to hand off the company.
And why is that?
Oh gosh, that's a long discussion. In a nutshell, I think it's a cultural issue. Okay, I mean and then we can talk about the details of different cultures in different countries, but it's a cultural issue.
I'd probably add taxes to that as well. You know, that's a big issue, at least in Scandinavia. I know that it's hard to be, you know, a VC in terms of just the way the tax system is constructed. So, so government funding is a good way.
So tax issues, but for the longest time in the major countries of Europe, it was very difficult. There was no concept of stock option. There was no concept of stock ownership. The companies that got started, let's talk about Germany, you know, you have many companies in Germany that are multi-billion dollars, that are 150 years old or more, that are still privately owned because they were formed 175 years ago. So if you want to create a new company today without, you don't have access to a structure that allows you to sell a portion of the company, to fund the company. So that also.
Anybody wants to add?
Yeah, actually, especially in Germany at least, there's some other form of funding which is exactly these old companies. So you have a lot of family funds there that are basically, you know, but they are very conservative in the way they invest. So there's definitely some possibilities to get money from there if you want to start something, but it's not easy to get in contact with them. They're not built into the whole scene.
Now, many of you probably have heard about Rocket Internet, the German Samuel brothers. I mean, they run a completely different show. They don't care about angel investing or anything. They give you a whole platform with everything that entails marketing power, that entails coding, everything. So, being in Germany, how do you, if you think back about at the time when you were mingling with German entrepreneurs, do you think they like this model, or is it frowned upon? What would you say?
I think there's two sides to that. Two different kinds of people. Somebody really don't like it because they want to be very creative and, you know, want to do their own new things. And then there's the people who actually like it because it's a very good business. And if you look at what they're doing, it's actually, I mean, we're not, with my company, we're not doing a copycat, but on the other hand, what they're doing is very creative on the way they build up their execution. So it's very admirable what they're actually doing. And I think the whole system in Berlin wouldn't have been where it is if they weren't there. And there are a lot of people coming out of Rocket with a lot of money, you know, they made from exits, and they can then fund on new startups. They gained a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience from working with them. So I think it's actually very admirable. But there are, of course, some people who don't think that.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, if you would rate, all of you, if you would rate the percentage of copycat startups, I mean, this is derogatory, of course, versus unique new idea startups, what would you say? Where's the split from Europe?
In Berlin? Or
in Berlin or in the greater European area?
In the greater European area, I don't think there are so many copycats. Again, I mean, the rate is definitely lower, but in Germany, it's high, definitely. It's 70% or something like that, I'm pretty sure.
In my limited experience in Spain, I saw a lot of business pitches and stuff that were even saying that we are literally copycatting something we saw work in the United States, and we are bringing it here to Spain. We believe it can work. You know, I think there is definitely potential for innovation, but a lot of copycat stuff, which can work, is happening.
Yeah, I don't think I have an opinion about that.
So, what does copycat mean? Okay, you know, innovation is a very funny thing. Innovation, there's no uniqueness to one idea in one particular place in the world. It turns out a lot of people think about a lot of things and see a problem and have a different way of, or sometimes a similar way of solving. And even on the hardware side, so clearly on the software side, it's a lot easier to take a model that is running, let's say in the United States, and say, oh, we're going to do exactly the same thing in China or the same thing in Germany, and it works. And why not? Because then it's a race, it's an execution. So what the German companies are saying is, hey, we're already here, we know the culture better, we're going to be faster than whatever the company before they, you know, so that's, and that, to me, that's pretty much fair. Even on the hardware side, and I'll take a very specific example on the hardware side. The last 5 years or so, there's been a tremendous amount of investment in the solar energy, building solar modules, right? And there's been dozens of companies that essentially are identical. The same premise, which is we believe we can make cheaper modules than the other guys. Well, it turns out that, you know, there's about 20 of those companies in China and nobody is making any money. But at the same time, it's generating a tremendous amount of investment in the technology, and the net result is in the last 5 years, the price of a solar module has decreased by an order of magnitude. So there are some benefits for that as well. And at the end, I don't think you can prevent copycat.
Well, I mean, from the entrepreneurial perspective, of course they created all these great technologies, but did they also benefit from it? Who's making the money now?
No, the people that are making the money are the people that are installing solar installations. Because the benefit of all these lower costs at the end is for the users of solar energy to pay very low rates.
So, you see a lot of companies coming from Europe to the US. If you had to help somebody to set a foot to Europe, what would you do?
So, one of the things, so from Europe to the US, or the
no, vice versa. I mean, we see a lot of people from Europe coming to the US, obviously, but vice versa. What would your advice be?
I think there are a couple of different things. So it comes back to understanding your industry, right? Where, you know, what city is going to be best for you. You're going to have certification issues if it's a hardware or licensing thing. Then I would probably go to the Scandinavian countries because they're very, very good when it comes to bureaucracy. So you'll be basically faced with all of the paperwork. You know, that's a good way to solve those things. Heavy industry, obviously, you know, Germany is probably a good place to start. I would say, so you know where you're going with that. The other thing, at least from my experience in Scandinavia, is having local partners. Particularly when you're going through government funding processes, there are, in Norway, resources available, you know, in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollar range for local entrepreneurs that aren't necessarily available to, you know, outside companies coming in. And if you just have one guy there that's part of that, then suddenly you have, or girl, I should say, that is part of that, then you have access to a whole new ball game in terms of network and resources.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're as an entrepreneur, if you want to go to Europe, it must be for a very specific reason, and that should not be for raising money, because it's harder to raise money in Europe than here. So therefore, depending on where you want to go and what is the specific reason, it could be partnering with government, getting some incentives, partnering with a customer, partnering with a company that can leverage whatever the country. So all of these choices have to come in to the decision, and you have to be really clear about what your business model for product or services is to select which country, because every country is very different. And you know, I don't think you can go to every country at once, so you got to choose where to go, and very specifically based on your business model.
That's true. I mean, Stefan, your previous startup grew to 23 countries globally, and how was it within Europe to really reach different countries? Because you create a buzz in one country and people know you. How do you make sure that people in other countries in Europe also know about you?
That's very different processes in the end, so it's very difficult. And I think if you want to go to Europe, if you want to go to another country in general, you need to test it out from where you are first, and then you check out whether it kind of works and you have some indication, and then you can go there. So what we did, we basically had our headquarters in one country only, in the beginning in Denmark, later on in Spain, and then we just, you know, translated everything and got it out there, and got some people internally in our headquarters to do it. And we just did it very rapidly and tested it out, and in the end we were in 23 countries, but the successful ones were maybe 15. So it was about just testing it and seeing if it worked or not. And I think this is what you should do, to test it out before you go there. And you can, with most things, you can test it out here from the US too. You need to make the appearances look as if you were there to test it properly.
Okay, so you mentioned a few were difficult. Could you explain which ones were different and why?
Yeah, Germany we were different. We were from Denmark. We never had success in Germany before. And it was a social network, so maybe it was because, I don't know, Germans are maybe not that kind of into this kind of social thing or whatever, but at the same time there was another one who was really successful, so Germany was very difficult, and that's also, you know, it's one of the biggest markets. That's the reason also I'm there now, so I can, you know, understand why it didn't work out last time. And what else? I think Eastern Europe is not easy either. Because it's a whole new, it's a very different background, it's a very different culture than the rest. I think the rest of Europe is very open to new things, and I think you can depending on the industry you belong.
Espen, you also want to? Chris,
I was just going to say, you know, I think traveling is the best educator besides our parents and the whole business school. And I would say, you know, I really agree with Stefan's point about doing a pilot test. And why not go travel to Europe and go check out a country and then try to just do a business, you know, transaction with someone in that country and get a feel. Because, so I had never been in Spain before from this perspective, and I learned so much just going there, doing something else, which was still justified with my thesis, but I learned so much about the business and how the culture affects innovation and your ability to do business there. But, you know, also you see all the advantages. So try to find what the strengths are to going to that particular country. I would argue traveling there would be a great pilot, a great place to take your spouse or significant other, but just reserve one day to go and you know, try to sell your product or service. But in pilots, go travel.
So I have a little story that can maybe sort of push in on that as well. You know, I ran basically a very small prototyping company in Denmark called Meme Maker. That was kind of linked into the internet memes and all of that stuff. And we sold this electronic chip called the Arduino. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but we noticed on our Facebook page that we're getting all of these hits from Turkey. Couldn't figure out, you know, why were we getting hits from Turkey, and finally figured it out because a Turkish friend of mine told me that meme basically means nipples or breasts. So you know, I guess, you know, like the moral of the story, it's very, very clear that language differences, cultural differences can really make a difference. And I mean, I would like to point out that there are a lot of different nationalities just in this room. And in San Francisco and the US in general, diversity is one of the big strengths. And I think that was one of the many things that makes the US a really, really attractive starting point, is that you can get people from, you know, pretty much any country in Europe, here in the Bay Area, started. And we've very consciously done this in the startup that we're at the moment, where I'm hiring in. And we're hiring pretty quick at the moment. We're getting one new person every 12 days on average. And you know, one of the things I'm looking for is how many languages do they speak? What experience do they have abroad? And we've covered something like about 9 languages at the moment in a staff of 17, 20 people. So.
Well, when you think about Europe, I mean, obviously we have so many nationalities there. What is a way to leverage these different nationalities? I mean, that's clearly Europe's biggest strength from the startup perspective. Could you expand on that?
Well, I mean, there's the old joke about, you know, how does it go? The perfect heaven is basically, you know, run by German efficiency and you know, English leadership and so on. And then hell is the exact opposite. Right? So I think, yeah, I mean, there's definitely some sort of character traits from each country. To be honest, I mean, you can generalize all you want, but at the end of the day, it's about the individual. I do believe that there are certain cultural differences that really you can use to a benefit and advantage. I'll just use Scandinavia as a really interesting example. There's a good book written by a woman called Karen Weiss called When Vikings Fight, Når Vikinger slåss. And basically what she says there is that, you know, looking at border cultures in Sweden versus Denmark, the Swedes are very, very democratically minded. And so you get an organization where, you know, if the leader is in a conversation with someone else, he's not going to go into a firm commit until he's gone back and actually asked pretty much everyone in his organization what they think, and then they'll go back and commit, generally speaking. The Danes are the exact opposite. You know? If you're in a meeting and you know, you disagree, you're expected to speak up and you're expected to say something. Whereas the Swedes will be sitting there waiting to hear, you know, to be asked what they think. And so the Swedes will go from the meeting and they'll be totally insulted because no one asked their opinion, right? And the Danes will be like, oh, it was fantastic, no, everyone agreed with me. And I've seen this because I taught at the Scandinavian school. And I think, you know, depending on the type of startup you need, you know, are you looking to create an organization where the culture is, you know, very distributed, where the leadership decisions need to be taken on a distributed level, then, you know, I think there are cultures that feed into that. And likewise, if you need very quick, autocratic decision-making capabilities, and there are other cultures that feed into that as well. So I do think that there are ways of leveraging culture in an interesting way. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you have.
So pivot of this, leveraging culture in an interesting way. I'll start by saying that one of the reasons Silicon Valley is so successful is because nobody cares where people are coming from. So first and foremost, a startup, especially early startup, is kind of a survival mode, and it's complete meritocracy. You either can do the job, or you have no place being in that company, right? The challenge for startups in Europe is that they tend to evolve completely homogeneous. So you'll have a French startup with 17 French people, you'll have a German startup with 12 German people, and so on and so forth. Right? And therefore you get very quickly to the culture impacting the performance of a startup, as opposed to the other way around. So, and that's why, as I said, that's one of the reasons why a lot of people come here, because this is where you can get things done.
That's interesting. I mean, we heard Rich from Elance before. Do you see a lot of freelancing going on for startups that crosses borders? Is that something that is happening?
Not really in my experience that much, at least. I mean, there's a lot of people actually coming, moving around, like I'm saying, like I said, but freelancing across borders is more difficult. If you have somebody within your company that knows somebody, you can basically do it, but there's not. I can finish with this.
The answer is yes. I mean, and it's not so much freelancing as opposed to outsourcing the work. Some of my partners have investment in companies that will write for you. So they'll write op-eds, they'll write articles, they'll write marketing pieces, and it turns out that it's outsourced all over the world. So it's a little bit like Elance, but for writing material. Mostly in the United States, mostly in English-speaking countries. But you'll find people in, let's say, Pakistan that speak very good English that will write based on the Elance model. So that's one of the enabling factor of this completely connected, globally connected community, is that you can have people do work wherever they reside based on their expertise.
I was just going to say that I actually ended up using Freelance and Odesk when I was in Spain to find an assistant to do work for me back in the United States. And I would just argue that this is actually a great way to make a pilot if you want to work with, let's say, Spaniards or someone else in Europe. Why not hire them via Odesk or Elance and see how they work as an individual, to see how the culture might affect you? Because for me, I started outsourcing and working with other countries in Asia, and you realize that these people are literally working to survive, and having that sort of weight on your shoulders as a manager, or as a director in your company, that's scary, but that's their bottom line and how they survive. But I could go back to an American, and I could hire an American from Spain, leverage time differences, and then they would understand me and my limited descriptions on how I could get things done without having to explain in full detail, write out literally word for word what they had to do, which I found in other countries. So use it as a pilot, try outsourcing to see if you want to go to that country.
Okay. I mean, just very practically, for people who want to go to Europe, it's a challenge to find a team on the ground, I guess. So, I mean, there's no AngelList. LinkedIn is less developed. There are a lot of local versions of LinkedIn that are used. Hubs are not as developed. We heard about that. Meetups are not existent like here. How the hell do you find a team?
So, really quickly, one way I found a team was through the Stanford eVentures program. I had already been in Spain, but we just managed to work with people that were in Madrid, Spain. And you can form a team very quickly with people who are like-minded entrepreneurs. So definitely use that as a way to connect to global key partners.
And on top of that, I would say also again, go there and then go to the hubs that are there, go to the places there are, co-working spaces, there are different networks already there. Maybe it's not one big thing like it is here with LinkedIn or meetups, but there are a lot of different places, there are a lot of small hubs, so you definitely go there, and then on top of that, use your own network. You know more people than you think, actually.
So you have to be there and really scout and look around.
I mean, I think there are lots of organizations just here in the Bay Area as well. You've got the Silicon Vikings for Scandinavia. I'm sure you have different, consulates will have different gatherings and meetups. If you really want to get to know people in different cultures. I mean, traveling is by far the best way to get a sense of the vibe and get a chance to go there. But before you travel, make sure to connect with the local and regional resources available just here. I mean, I'm pretty sure pretty much every country in the world has a consulate or embassy here in San Francisco and up further north. So, I mean, the best advice I ever got when it comes to these things as well was like, drop Facebook, hit the gym, sort of thing. You know, it's kind of like dating, and you know, just making myself more attractive in terms of the skills and competencies that I bring to the table within that depth and industry depth, because I'm a bit of a generalist, in case you didn't notice, and you know, building that industry depth as well it makes it a lot easier to find the right people, whatever city you are in, and wherever you're heading as well.
Okay. So I think we have maybe 5 more minutes, then I really would like to open the questions to the audience. So maybe from the top level, I mean, Europe is growing together, clearly, despite the Euro crisis and everything. Do you see the startup ecosystem grow together as well? Is it connected as the European Union is, or is it more side?
So, you know, so what I observe, and I observe this through a lot of what I would call trade missions, a lot of exploratory missions coming from Europe over to the United States. I observe that there's a strong willingness, there's an understanding, and now there's a strong willingness to find a way to promote this startup culture, this innovation culture, this company development. Because what you said earlier, this is a lot of the jobs come from now. I think there's still a long ways to go, but I'm very encouraged with what is going on right now. So the problem is that the timing, that's on one timeline, and the timeline is dependent on different country. Startups don't have the time, so startups will go wherever they need to do. So there's a disconnect between that. So, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there might be just an infrastructure that will allow local startups to benefit from that. Right now, it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, I really would second that as well. I don't see that happening just yet. But I would say that, you know, the nice thing about Europe is that it's very easy to get around in Europe. And so, you know, going to different events and industry-specific conferences and stuff, it's a small world. And I would say, you know, if you have a business or a startup in the US that you want to bring into the European market, if you can figure one of the countries out, that's, you know, the jump from one country to the next isn't necessarily that big if you plan it properly, and particularly if you hire the right people in that one country that know the other people in the other countries as well.
I agree that it's not there yet, but on the other hand, I'm seeing it happening a lot actually, that people are connected over countries, and they are traveling around a lot, and everything gets more fluid. You have a lot of, especially with the crisis, a lot of people coming from Spain and Italy who are looking at where should I get a job, and they're looking at Germany or London or whatever, and they apply there.
And they look at entrepreneurship as a job opportunity?
Absolutely, absolutely, because it's a lot more flexible, and you can, you know, there's a lot of opportunity, and it's most of the time easier to get a job there than, you know, if you don't have any specific skill with the country, you can still get a job as a Spanish person in London or in English, and then operate from there in the Spanish market. So it's happening a lot, I think, and if you look at the entrepreneurs, they are also very flexible, moving a lot around, and you know, they are. I have a lot of friends who are then, you know, they're interconnected from Copenhagen to Berlin to London to Barcelona or Paris or wherever. Of course, it's not enough, but it's happening more and more, I think. So it's kind of putting a layer on top of you know, the regulatory European Union.
I know you've been doing more of this stuff within Europe than I have, and I'm curious whether you have a feeling about the difference between city-based startups and regional startups as well. You know, whether there's a big difference between, you know, the #1 city in the country, you know, like Copenhagen, versus Aarhus or you know, some of the more regional spaces.
I mean, in the end, I think the big hubs, they are connected more than Copenhagen with the other cities in Denmark. So there are basically 2 in Denmark, and in Germany there's a couple, and maybe in Spain it's the same, but they are more connected with each other across the countries than actually with the regional ones. You have to go to one of the big hotels. Everything else is an exception.
I found when I was living in Aarhus, which is not Copenhagen, it was actually cheaper for me to fly from Copenhagen to London than it was for me to take the train from Aarhus to Copenhagen. Okay. So it gives you an idea.
I mean, Espen, you've been an entrepreneur in the Nordic countries. You're now here. Would you ever go back?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because the skills that I've developed here, I think, are much sharper than I would necessarily have done in the Nordic countries. So it's the small fish in a big pond, big fish in a small pond.
Okay, same.
When I go back, I'll be like.
All right. Maybe just a quick flash, 30 seconds of all of you four. What would your advice be if somebody here in the audience wanted to go to Europe?
I would say definitely if you're feeling like you want to go and it makes sense for your business, go there personally. There's a lot of opportunity. Look at it from a glass half full than a glass half empty approach. I mean, Spain sounds like a horrible place to be right now, but you have a great quality of life. You can find cheap entrepreneurs. You can find cheap workers. You can find great hubs. Again, you'll be a big fish in a small pond. You can leverage what you know here in the United States across borders. Skype was my best friend. And like I said, I connect globally to so many people and all over Europe when I was there. So pick a city that is definitely a connecting city, like Copenhagen, London, Barcelona, Madrid, and definitely go in there knowing what you might be up against culturally. But definitely, if you're able to figure out how to make it work.
And I would even say, like, test it before if you can. Before you don't need to travel there. You can do some testing, whatever you're doing, sales or whatever you're doing. You can do that on the phone before. If you have a company that does that, so you can test it out.
Yeah, I think testing is really the key, and know your industry, go deep, and then that'll, in large extent, dictate where you're heading in the world as well, and then travel.
Okay.
I'll be the contrarian voice. I would ask, why would you want to do that?
Okay.
And you have to have a really good reason. So, for example, if I were an investor in a company that wants to go to Europe, we'd have to have a really great talk about convincing me why you want to do that.
Maybe a bottle of wine would help.
I look forward to talking.
Okay, great. Yeah, Spain has great wine too. Yeah, thanks to all of you guys. I would like to open now for questions in the audience. Is there anybody who wants to ask somebody to those four gentlemen?
Hi, is crowdfunding catching on in Europe, or is this a US phenomenon?
I know, at least in Spain, it's very difficult to crowdsource, and they have several copycat Kickstarter platforms, but they just don't get a lot of buzz. And I guess Kickstarter just opened up in London. So yes, it's there, but the culture is not super supportive of it. I would say that the United States is very special in that regard, that we support the underdog, and we really like to see people changing things in this world, especially from a technology standpoint. Europe, at least in my perspective, Spain specifically, was not very eager to invest in potentially risky crowdsourced ventures.
I'm seeing a lot of platforms coming up in Germany, at least, and there are some companies getting funded, but there's a problem after that. I don't think it's as streamlined as over here. So you basically, if you get crowdfunding in the first round, you have a problem getting follow-up funding because the regulatory stuff is so difficult.
I'm actually seeing a lot of the design houses, Scandinavian design, being a big sort of thing that lends itself very well to crowdfunding projects. They're definitely catching on.
Yeah, so my name is Lars, I'm from Norway, I'm studying a PhD in entrepreneurship.
Oh, Norwegian!
Yeah! We stick together. Yeah. So I have a question about like introducing new disruptive technology and like the advantages of going abroad for having more of a puppy dog strategy so basically like here in the hub, this is my third year here, and like if you do anything here and it gains traction, everyone is like, oh, this guy's getting traction, maybe we should copy them, right? So if you were to go abroad and where there's like, you don't get like the same media attention, but you can like develop the technology and like you get the feedback and all of that, and then at some point come back. I was wondering if so I'm working on a global payment solution which has a built-in loyalty rewards program in it. And one of my co-founders is from Venezuela, has done mobile banking there for like 10 years. So does it make more sense to go there, do it in Venezuela, than to do it in the Bay Area? What do you?
I think that's a really good question, because one thing I've noticed quite a few companies that my friends have started to do is they'll fly under the radar by testing it out in a city in some other language than English, because even if it gets blogged about in the media, you don't see that's not going to get translated as easily, and so you can actually build quite a solid ecosystem and business in a different place just as a test, and then you bring it into the US and go big.
Over there, was questions? Thank you.
Hey guys, I have a question. Have you ever done business in Switzerland related to innovation or IT or gaming? I just have a personal interest, and I was wondering if you had any experience opening businesses there. Thanks.
So they were Ernesto from our previous panel, he from Ecosystem Ventures. The company is based out of Switzerland, so he might be somebody connected. I'm not sure if it's still around. Okay.
Hi, I'm Larry Louie. Some of you know me. I'm the Dean of Health San Francisco. And first, I'd like to thank the panelists for participation. It was awesome, and I'm sure that everyone in the group here is appreciative of your contribution today. My question is that part of what makes Silicon Valley so amazing is not just the entrepreneurs or the intellectual property, but the ecosystem that we call it. The supportiveness of all the professional service firms, like access to lawyers and consultants and engineers, and the willingness for people to take risks, the willingness for companies to be beta sites for aspiring new entrepreneurs with new ideas. Which cities or countries in Europe would you say are the closest in terms of the ecosystem that would allow the growth of great startup ideas?
From my perspective, I live in Berlin, so I think Berlin is great. I think London is also very good. I haven't experienced Paris, so I don't really know. But I think maybe not. So Berlin and London.
I gotta keep supporting Spain, Barcelona. As you go further north, I think you're gonna get more acceptance in terms of entrepreneurial spirit, and we have to have Silicon Valley transplants to go out there and again use a little bit of Silicon Valley arbitrage and be the voice of entrepreneurship, and then you'll come back to the United States with the American dream being a very real thing. So definitely entrepreneurship is growing in Spain, and there's a lot of places. Come talk to me afterwards if you want to go there.
All right. Last one?
Yeah, I mean, I got a second in Berlin, I think, as the number one. But I would say that the interesting thing for London-based startups is, of course, that English is a language spoken in more places than just London. So it gives them an edge, I think.
All right. So, thanks, everybody. And to quote Adir Rassi, thanks for those nuggets of awesomeness. I think we're going to have a little break now.
We want to keep you well fed and well drunk, so the bar is open again and the food is ready. But be sure to ask questions to our panel in the break room.